He's saying the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. He's being accused of falsely aligning himself with God. And Jesus basically responds with a radical statement of non-duality, basically. That's basically what he's saying. He's saying me and the Father are one.
What if the real teaching of Jesus is nothing like what most people think? What if the truth has actually been hiding in plain sight for over 2,000 years? You know, Jesus never asked to be worshipped like a god from afar. What if Jesus was actually trying to point us toward a state of consciousness that is accessible to all of us? Today we're going to take a deep dive into the Gospel of John and explore a radical, non-dual reading of Jesus as the embodiment of the divine Logos and see what it can mean for us. John 1. John is actually the fourth gospel in the Bible, right? It's the last gospel. John opens in a way that actually we haven't seen up until that point. It's like immediately from the start, there's a difference between John and the other gospels, because John opens with a reference to Genesis, basically, like a little throwback to the beginning of the Old Testament. He says, "In the beginning was the Word." In the beginning was the Logos, is really what he's saying. In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. You know, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, or the darkness comprehended it not, right? There's different translations, of course. That's where we start. Okay, so do you have any sort of associations already when you just hear that?
No, I would let you associate with that first.
Okay, well, it's interesting. So John doesn't begin with the birth of Christ, with the birth story, but actually begins with this cosmic statement about the nature of reality echoing Genesis. So this word logos in the ancient world, Greek concept, carries a lot of philosophical weight, and it's been translated in numerous ways. Really, there is no good translation for it in English, you could say. It referred to the rational principle or the ordering intelligence underlying the universe. And so John's claim is pretty radical. It's like the Logos, the structure and meaning of reality itself, has become embodied in a human form in the figure of Jesus. So Jesus is no longer just merely a teacher of truth. No, he is the living manifestation of the truth, the very truth that sustains the cosmos. So what does that mean to you when you hear that, Andrew?
Well, first of all, I would like to go back to the word, the idea of the word. So in the beginning was the word. I just associated with that, with the Logos and the word, with almost like a kind of intelligence,
Yeah.
And so it's almost like you have this kind of nothingness state, this non-being perhaps, and then out of this pure void, this pure potential, out of that becomes a mind or an intelligence, a spark. And that's kind of also like the very intelligence that's ordering the universe. It's not just random. There's intelligence.
Yeah.
So
That's right. Let's continue on with the story.
Yes.
So I'm going to skip over some parts, because basically what I did is I picked the most salient parts from the gospel. Then we arrive at John 3. There we have a statement that I found interesting. So it's John 3:16-18. It reads, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." And then it says, "Whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." This is an interesting one to me, because I think here, there's kind of like, there's a certain reading that you see a lot in our culture. In Christian evangelical circles, for instance, interpreting this reading is like, you have to accept Jesus and believe in Jesus, and then you're saved. And if you don't believe in Jesus, then you're not saved. But in John, the word believe, does not mean the same thing as it does it for us in English. The word believe, as John uses it here, actually means something more like existential entrustment. So it's not some kind of intellectual agreement with a proposition. It's like I believe this statement to be true, as in like, sort of I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that's I profess my belief, and so I'm saved. That's not actually what John is saying. It's something much more subtle, and it's something much more deep. What he's talking about, in my interpretation, is he's talking about participatory alignment. So if we read it with that interpretation, then basically the passage reads something like this. Reality itself is structured by self-giving love. That's what Jesus embodies, self-giving love. Those who align with that love participate in life. And those who resist it remain in fragmentation. They remain in this narrow ego identification that seeks to glorify themselves or better themselves, but they actually don't participate in the life in its fullness. So they remain in fragmentation.
I think.
What do you think?
I think a few ideas come to mind. For one, first of all, like another way to think of God or this absolute divine principle is something like a highest value. And on the other hand, you have your ego, which is basically it's kind of like a self-cherishing attitude towards life. And I think to add to that, what it means, what Jesus represents, one way of seeing it is that he represents a human being who is totally aligned with the divine principle.
Exactly.
To the extent that he is the divine principle, because he has entered a divine union with God.
And then the question is like, what does it mean to believe in that? Well, it means that you put your trust in the Son. And in a way, it means that you surrender to the Son. But the fact is, you're not surrendering to the Jesus as a sort of, some kind of separate entity, because actually what Jesus represents is the very opposite of being a separate entity. It's actually being in a state of complete alignment and union. And so if you surrender to that, that means that you allow that to actually also become you. That's what it means to trust in the Son. It means to participate in that divine life. And to resist the Son means to remain in existential alienation. Like through your rigid ego identification, there's actually existential alienation. And then when we read in John that like if you reject the Son, you will not see life, instead the wrath of God will be on you. That's the wrath of God, is actually, that alienation and the consequences that yields. That is the wrath of God. It's not some kind of supernatural entity that punishes you because you haven't been good. It's just what you bring upon yourself by choosing to remain in existential alienation. Okay, so getting into the next section. So I want to zoom in on a section in John 5. So what precedes this section is Jesus does some healing, and then he's doing that on the Sabbath. So then the Jewish leaders begin to persecute him because he's doing it on the Sabbath. Then Jesus tells them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. So he's saying like, there's no distinction between me and the Father. The Father is working, so I'm working. Of course, the Jewish religious authorities get very upset at him for saying that, because he's breaking the Sabbath and he's calling God his own Father. They're like, oh my God, this guy, we gotta get him, because that was really like, taboo. So then Jesus gives them this answer, right? Jesus replies. He says, truly, truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself unless he sees the Father doing it. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Basically saying that the Logos that Jesus embodies does not operate as an isolated individual consciousness. Actually, he's actually transparent to the self-expression of the ground of being, which is the Father.
And it's basically an expression because he's being exposed by the power structure. He's being accused of falsely aligning himself with God. So he's being accused of saying, you are not God. By what authority do you have to speak and do these things? And Jesus basically responds with a radical statement of non-duality, basically. That's basically what he's saying. He's saying, me and the Father are one. He is saying that you don't understand is that when I'm acting from the divine intelligence. And it's like you were saying, that when the Logos, when you have this absolute alignment like Christ, then your intelligence becomes an expression of the divine intelligence. Your consciousness becomes an expression of divine consciousness and the Godhead. And so that's what he's acting from. And that's also why he's not bound by the by the small human morality of the Jewish tradition at the time, and the kind of the customs and the laws of society, because he's not in this relative moral system. He's in this like spontaneous pouring forth of love and intelligence and intuition from the source of creation, because he's tuned in with that. And so it's a radical affirming and authority of yourself, basically your sovereignty as a spiritual being. Yeah, those are some thoughts.
Yeah, amazing. Exactly. That's exactly also the direction I was thinking in. So that's very cool.
Okay, so shall we continue with the textual analysis?
Yeah, let's do it. So this is a point where we're going to get into some of the miracles that Jesus performed, and I think it's interesting to look at this because these are sort of a little bit more puzzling, and they're a little bit more challenging to interpret, I would say. I'm not going to give any definitive answers about that. I just want to say that beforehand, because I don't know, right? And I'm not in a position to judge that necessarily. So the passage reads,
what's the passage
when
again?
evening came, John 6, verse 16 to 21.
Okay.
Jesus walks on water. So when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was already dark, and Jesus had not yet gone out to them. Strong wind was blowing, the sea grew agitated. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the sea, and they were terrified. But Jesus spoke up, "It is I, do not be afraid." And then they were willing to take him into the boat, and at once the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So there's a lot that's packed into this little narrative, right? And so this is the question, like, what is this? What's going on here? Is this a demonstration of magical power? Is this like what you in a Hindu context would call like a siddhi? It's like a magical capability of Jesus to walk on water, to kind of like be weightless and levitate, right? Is that what's going on? Or is it a more mythological, symbolic narrative where it's like, well, the sea represents, the chaos that you encounter in the world, and that Jesus hovers above that, right? He's not contaminated by that. He can sort of, he's transcendent of that. He's not touched by that. And that when he enters the boat, the fact that instantly arrival happens when Jesus enters the boat, like they reach the shore instantly, that to me indicates like this is kind of like symbolic of what happens when alignment occurs. Where there's striving and struggle with the sea, with the chaos, right? As soon as alignment occurs and Christ comes to you, striving ends and the destination is realized, right? That's another reading. Nice. So I don't know what you think about that.
I wouldn't have come to that from reading it, but I think that's beautiful. I think, yeah, it's like, because that's very interesting. Because it's like when you awaken, then there's nothing to strive for. Then you're home, kind of. And when you're aligned and the Christ consciousness is awakened within you, then you're kind of home. You've made it. You're safe. That's interesting.
This is interesting because this Jesus walking on water comes right after he actually feeds the 5,000. And I wanted to get into that after, because there's a passage that follows the Jesus walking on water that I found very interesting, which refers to Jesus actually, performing this other miracle where he, there's this group of 5,000 people who are hungry. There's not enough bread to feed them, bread and fishes, right? And then Jesus, through his magical power, multiplies, the food to actually feed the 5,000 somehow. I think what the point is also with these miracles, that at least insofar as Jesus is concerned, he's like, you guys are all impressed by the miracles, but like it's beside the point. They're pointing towards something else, which is actually more important, which people are not actually understanding. And so this actually is, for me, confirmed by what happens after Jesus walks on water, which, the people who he just fed with multiplying the bread and the fishes, they come back to Jesus asking him for more. Then Jesus tells them, right? He tells them, and this is John 6, verse 26 to 36, if you want to read along. He says, "Truly, truly, I tell you, it is not because you saw these signs that you are looking for me, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. You know, they just want more of what he can give them in terms of this material sustenance, right? And then he says, do not work for food that perishes, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then a little bit later on, John 6:47-58, Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you, he who believes, and remember, believing is like, existential alignment. He who believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And this bread, which I will give for the life of the world, is my flesh. At this, the Jews began to argue amongst themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of Man, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so also the one who feeds on me will live because of me. So, what is this? Some kind of ritual cannibalism? Or is it simply a Eucharistic doctrine, telling you to go to church every Sunday and receive the Eucharist?
No.
Is that what Jesus is talking about?
No, I don't think so. I think now when you read the rest of the story, the whole miracle context, the whole meaning is kind of like a parable, or I see what the story is kind of more about, because he does a miracle to kind of amaze them, to bedazzle them, and then they come and they want more bread and they want more of a miracle. They just want the material, low level things, and he's saying no. What you actually want is the true divinity. And that's where the true bread comes from and the true sustenance comes from. Those people become an example of like the mistaken, ignorant search in life for the material goods. Whereas he's saying that these material goods actually came from the divine, and you should seek them at their real source, which is the divine. And that pleasure and that joy comes from the divine, but go to the source of it, the real joy.
Exactly.
Such a funny thing. It's like, sir, always give us this bread. Like, if you have this bread, why don't you just always give us bread? What are you doing? It's like, sir, please give us the bread always. It's a fair point though. Like, I understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I would like to zoom in on the next chapter a little bit, because I do think there's more to cover here. That's gonna reveal some more insights. So take a look at John 13, verse 1-11. This is the passage where Jesus washes the disciples' feet, which is, I think, a very symbolically significant act that he's committing. I'll just read it out, and then we can see what it says to us. Jesus knew that the Father had delivered all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the supper, laid aside his outer garments, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with a towel that was around him. He came to Simon Peter, who asked him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Never shall you wash my feet, Peter told him. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Well then, Lord, Simon Peter replied, not only my feet, but my hands and head as well. Jesus told him, whoever has already bathed needs only to wash his feet, and he will be completely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you. For he knew who would betray him. And this is why he said, not all of you are clean. So let's just stop it there and see what it suggests to us. There's a couple things going on, right? So first of all, Jesus knows that what is coming. He knows his fate. Like, he knows the future events that are gonna conclude his time on earth and send him back to the Father. Then, it's said that he loves the disciples. He takes off his outer garments, so there's sort of a stripping away of his role in this world in a way. And then he washes the disciples' feet. And then, Peter resists that because he's like, of course, washing the feet sometimes, you got to imagine that in this context, like normally, like washing the feet is like a very lowly thing to do. And it wouldn't even be asked of Jewish servants to wash the feet of other Jews, right? So this was like a very kind of debasing, humiliating act in a way. And so when Jesus gets to Peter and wants to wash his feet, Peter is like, he can't accept that. He just wants to revere Jesus as somehow sort of above him and something to look up to and to maybe aspire towards. He feels awkward sort of accepting this type of devotion from Jesus. But Jesus said, like, if you do not realize what I'm doing, you will understand later. And he says that unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Unless you can accept this of me, then actually you can't be aligned with me, because then you don't understand what I'm doing, what this actually means, what the significance is of this. Do you already want to say something about that, or shall I still read a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I feel like the first thing is that it definitely shows the degree to which Jesus is trying to radically undermine expectations or the power structure or the way things are in social convention. So he's being revolutionary. It's completely against the whole power structure. He's supposed to be the leader of these people.
Yeah.
He's supposed to be the spiritual authority, and he's completely reversing the roles. So he's putting the whole thing on its head. And that's kind of also a big part of the story of Jesus, that he is someone who's radical and he challenges the existing power structures of the society and the religious order and the religious authority and the beliefs and ideologies of the day. So this is an example of that. And I think it shows him expressing a deep love, a deep fundamental non-dual love. So he's washing their feet. He's saying that it's not about ego, and it's an expression. And you see this with gurus and saints and sages, like people licking the wounds of lepers or something, leprosy, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This kind of radical, like, loving of things that are rejected or pushed aside, or people that are rejected and pushed aside. This like extreme superhuman level of love and selflessness. So I think that's a manifestation of that.
Yeah, I agree, actually. And actually, interestingly enough, actually, Jesus also makes that explicit. So I'll read the next passage, and then you'll see what I mean. So this is verse 12 to 17. So it says that when Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer garments, he reclined with them again and asked, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me the teacher and Lord, and rightly so, because I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example so that you should do as I have done for you. Truly, truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Exactly like you were saying, like the true divine power is actually the divine power that kneels, and if you want to share in that, that means you kneel too, And ancient religion often associated, holiness with separation, with like a special class, with something to be revered. But John here reveals that, like, true holiness is actually the touching of the feet. So it's dismantling the sacred distance, right? It's bringing the sacred to the most intimate, intimate touch, actually. So that's very interesting. Okay, I suggest we move on and see what the next verses reveal to us. So I'll read a little bit of the rest of chapter 13, because it's actually very interesting. So what Jesus does next, he's gathered with the disciples, and then he predicts his own betrayal, right? So this is verse 21 to 30. After Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, perplexed as to which one of them he meant. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining at his side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus which one he was talking about. Leaning him back against Jesus, he asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this morsel after I have dipped it." Then he dipped the morsel and gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. And when Judas had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus said to Judas, "What you are about to do, do quickly." But no one at the table knew why Jesus had said this to him. Since Judas kept the money back, some thought that Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. As soon as he had received the morsel, Judas went out into the night. So this is a pretty significant scene, of course, in the plot that's unfolding. So it's interesting that Jesus indicates who is the one that's going to betray him by actually giving him a morsel, by offering him a piece of food. So that's also actually Jesus extending intimacy in a way to Judas. The truth is offered one final time, but also Jesus knows that Judas is gonna reject it, and so then that kind of consolidates the misalignment that's already there, that's already been foreshadowed, and that I think that's what it means when Satan enters into Judas. It's like the fragmentation becomes total, you know. He's totally fragmented and he's totally cut off in that moment in his misalignment. And Jesus knows that there's nothing he can do about that. He cannot prevent that from happening because there is the true free will to act according to our own autonomy.
And I think,
I
think Jesus is also acknowledging that it's meant to happen, that it's part of Judas's story, and that he's serving a role in the narrative. And with the bread, he's showing that it is like an intimate act, and that he still loves him, he forgives him,
right,
by doing that. And the point is that Judas represents an aspect of our humanity, basically. He sins, he misses the mark, and he can't help it. And so him playing this role in the narrative is an element of the story, and it serves a purpose.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then it's interesting that right after that, what's followed in the following verses is actually Jesus, in a way, giving his first real teaching or his real commandment, like his direct teaching to the disciples. You know, after Judas has left, he says, "A new commandment I give you to the disciples. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you also must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." And that's very significant, because how has he just, demonstrated his mode of loving? It's actually by kneeling, the foot washing, and by giving the bread even to Judas. And then basically his teaching his explicit teaching is, this is the way you should love one another. And if you do that, that will be the true mark of your alignment, right? As the true followers of Christ, or the followers of the divine Logos.
Yeah, and I think the word love. I mean, why is love so important? I think one of the ideas that I like is that love also is entailed in the non-duality of life, in the oneness, and and the wholeness and integration, because love is the connection and unity of opposites, and so it's a natural consequence of oneness. It's another way of saying unity or oneness. It's, we're living in this world with separate parts and different people, and to love them is to be in accordance with the principle of oneness and unity.
I'd like to take a look at another one that I also think that often is misappropriated, and you're gonna know what I'm talking about. So this is John 14, 5-7. Thomas says, "Lord, we do not know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" And then Jesus answers, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." So, evangelicals love this one, right? They read like, Christianity is the one true religion. All other paths are false. Jesus teaches the correct doctrine. You have to believe in the correct theology. Only explicit Christians, those who profess Christ as a personal Lord and Savior, are saved, and non-Christians are going to be excluded. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except me. They put it on billboards, like in America, saying that, this is proof that,
I was just
you
thinking
need to follow Christ.
Yeah. There's a billboard like that in Cape Town. I was just thinking about that.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it just has John 14:6, and it's like, that's what it's saying. It has that text there.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a banger. I mean, it's a banger saying, though. It's a great statement. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Like, what a powerful
Yeah,
statement.
yeah. And the way, how is the logos the way? Well, the way is like that is alignment with ultimate reality. That's what we've been talking about, right? And so alignment with ultimate reality is like becoming transparent to the divine, which is actually omnipresent, like making God your agent, so to speak. That's the mode of alignment that we're talking about here. And truth, to me, it's like it's not propositional truth, It's truth as actually like the disclosure. It's the logos that reveals that what is real, not your egoic illusions, but the real that you can participate in, and that very participation in the divine vitality, that's the life. That's what I make of that. That's just a logical reading based on sort of what we've covered so far. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, if you think about how we defined Jesus as representing a non-dual consciousness, a non-dual state of consciousness, he's saying that this non-dual state of consciousness is the way and the truth and the life. It's the absolute.
Yeah.
It's the thing. You can trust in this. You can have faith in this.
Yeah.
In this state of alignment and this union with God. This is the ultimate way. This is the way, the truth.
Yeah.
And I agree with the truth. It's not truth can't be thought of only as a propositional logic type of thing. Truth should be more seen, especially in this context, as something like being or the way things are. It's like truth is what reality is in actuality. And in the non-awakened state, in the ordinary state of consciousness, there's a lack of truth, because you're in this separation and this illusory perception of life. You're in this separateness and you're in this ego consciousness. So there's a obfuscation of truth. But in the awakened state, or in the spiritual salvation in the Christian terms, or in the alignment with the logos, then truth is revealed, and then you actually perceive being for what it is.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
That's truth, as opposed to the misalignment.
Yeah. And I think also
that's the way.
Exactly. And a confirmation of that, and the fact that it's not some kind of special status of Jesus that's kind of like exclusive and needs to be accepted as an external deity, like as an external personal Lord and Savior, is actually affirmed in the passage right after, where Jesus says, this is John 14:12-14, truly, truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I am doing. He will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me for anything in my name, I will do it. So he's actually affirming that, like, if you believe in me, and believing doesn't mean like you do profess faith. It actually means, it's kind of like a intimate sort of, letting the logos indwell in you, it's an embodied relational participatory type of alignment. If you embody that, then you can do the things Christ did and even greater things. There's no reason why you should be any less aligned than Christ was. In fact, he's telling you that, like, this is the way. That's the way to go. He's leading by example. And the way to follow him is not just by professing faith, but it's actually by embodying what Christ embodied, right? It's also about the self-giving, about the love, about the service. That's the emergent fruit, right? That's the fruit that's born out of that alignment, and that's the kind of work that will be carried on after Jesus, is no longer here in the flesh.
Yeah, that's nice. This also very much aligns with Yogananda's reading of Christ, or his understanding of Christ, where he says that the second coming of Christ is going to be the Christ consciousness that awakens in mankind, generally, the Christ that awakens within you. And so he says that whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do greater things than these. So he's saying, like, I'm giving you this teaching, and it's yours, and kingdom of heaven is within you. It's not only within me, it's in you. That's the key. That's critical of what Jesus is saying. And so I think that idea of Yogananda, and it's also in the New Age as well, that the second coming of Christ, what that really means is the awakening of Christ consciousness, and the awakening of this non-dual consciousness, this discovering the kingdom of heaven on earth within human beings here and now, is the second coming, the Christ consciousness within everyone. And that's also a radical, powerful idea.
Absolutely. So for me, at this point, when I was reading the text, I was kind of thinking like, okay, so what does it mean if you're aligned with that, and if you follow Jesus by, in a way, imitating Jesus, right? Or you take Jesus as the role model. It's like Jesus' self-giving love was so complete, was so absolute, right? That it's like it's difficult to kind of, it sets the standard very high in a way, or that's what it looks like. From some perspective, it's like, well, how am I gonna, live up to that? How am I gonna give to the extent that Jesus did and not burn myself out? So that's then it got me thinking. It's like, yeah, of course, it's not like we shouldn't try to be like Christ in the sense that it leads to that inflation and then contraction. But we should actually learn how to give in a way that shows humility and is sustainable and that doesn't drain you or burn you out. And like, how do you do that? Well, you do that actually by sort of relinquishing your ego, right? Instead of letting the ego become sort of like this savior complex or martyr complex. That's the kind of spiritual inflation, like I must give like Christ, like I must save, I must carry others. It's like disguised as holiness, but really it's ego inflation, which inevitably will be corrected by the psyche. So I was thinking about that, and then I read John 15 and it's like, there's my answer, actually right there. So I'm going to read this and then you can tell me what you think about it. So I'll read John 15, 1-8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. I think there's the key to my question, right? There's the answer to my question. For me, it means that like spiritual fruit, doesn't come from your personal effort, actually. It doesn't come from from the ego, right? But it comes from abiding, being a part of the vine. Like you are a branch, you're not the entire vine, right? It's not through your isolated ego. It's actually when your ego is isolated, then it's the branch that withers, and that withers and dies and is thrown into the fire to be burned up. But if you're connected, if you can relinquish your ego and you can be connected, then the flow of the vine can flow through you, and then actually you can bear much fruit. And then the fruit is not through your effort, it's not through your merit, right? It's actually the fruit that you're just allowing to come into being through you, through this sustained participation in the logos, right? And that's what I read in that. What do you think about that, Andrew?
Beautiful. I don't have anything to add. I love that. I thought that was a great exposition and introduction as well to that verse.
Nice. All right. Shall we move on then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So now we're going to get into the betrayal of Jesus. So now the plot is thickening, This is John 18, 1-27. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where they entered a garden. Now Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a band of soldiers and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. They arrived at the garden carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was coming upon him, stepped forward and asked them, "Whom are you seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. Jesus said, "I am he." And Judas, his betrayer, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. "I told you that I am he," Jesus replied. "So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word he had spoken, "I have not lost one of those you have given me." Then Simon Peter, Peter is there with Jesus, drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. "Put your sword back in its sheath," Jesus said to Peter. "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Here, it's like Jesus, there's like a contrast in the narrative. It's like Jesus is like bold, composed, sovereign, immediately comes to the fore, says, "I am he," and they kind of cower almost in the presence, in the face of that sovereign sort of composed presence. And then Peter, kind of in a moment of inflation, is impulsive and reactive, and is not aligned with Jesus, is not aligned with Jesus' attitude, but kind of wants to prove his loyalty to Jesus. Of course, Jesus has already told Peter like that Peter is going to deny Jesus, but in this moment, like, Peter is desperate to prove himself. So he draws a sword and like he acts out and he cuts off the right ear of one of the men assailing Jesus. So there's a big contrast there, right? It's the logos alignment of Jesus versus the ego reactivity of Peter. Then Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. So I'll read on. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he also went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. Then the disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. At this, the servant girl watching the door said to Peter, "Aren't you also one of this man's disciples?" "I am not," he answered. Because it was cold, the servants and officers were standing around a charcoal fire that they had made to keep warm, and Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Then we've got Peter's second and third denials. Simon Peter was still standing and warming himself, so they asked him, "Aren't you also one of his disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter denied it once more, and immediately a rooster crowed. So this is a very interesting, development. It's like Peter goes from like the inflated courage of the sword, trying to prove his loyalty to Jesus, to like one scene later, it's like people ask him like, "Aren't you like with Jesus?" He's like, "What? That guy? Like, I've never seen that guy in my life." Like just denies knowing Jesus.
Yeah. It's fascinating. He's overcompensating, right? He's basically overcompensating for his own fear, his own lack of alignment, and his own feeling of like his own feeling of not being enough or something, or not being good enough, or not being loyal enough. And he's trying to prove himself to Jesus constantly by these big displays, this kind of like over displays, but he can't walk his talk, and he can't actually, in the moment of truth, he can't actually hold up to the calling, which is like the ultimate calling is to tell the truth and then to face the consequences and be crucified alongside Jesus.
Yeah.
But that's just too much for him to bear. And so that also, I think, represents an aspect of humanity and ourselves when we can't be aligned too much. We can't handle it. And so we see that in Peter, that kind of vulnerability and that failure, missing the mark. Yeah. And like we talked about the other day, I mean, can you just imagine being Peter and your greatest failure, you betrayed the Son of God, and then you're like immortalized in the Bible forever for 2,000 years as this character who was exposed before the world.
Yeah. Brutal.
It's rough. And Jesus reads him. Jesus knows already that he's going to do this.
Yeah. So that's it, basically. Then the destiny is fulfilled. Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate. Tension between the political power and the truth is dramatized. Through this whole narrative. Pilate actually repeatedly declares that he finds no guilt in Jesus. He's like, "I don't see what this man did wrong. It's like, I don't even have a reason to crucify him." But the religious authorities, they insist, that he crucify Jesus. They even give them an opportunity. It's like, "Well, I'm going to crucify 3 people, but because it's Passover, you can actually choose one, and I'll set him free. So if you want, you still have an opportunity to save him." But then they don't do that, of course, right? They save the other guy, and so the destiny is fulfilled.
Yeah, it's crazy moment. It's like there's so much. It's like Jesus is the divine principle. He is the light. He's the true goodness principle. And these freaking religious leaders, these priests, they just can't help it. They can't help. They're like, get rid of this guy. We cannot have him. And their
Yeah.
ego, because he's such a threat to the ego, and he's such a threat to the collective
Right.
ego as well of the power structure and the institutional religion.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, well put. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Then I'm not going to read out extensively sort of what goes on around the crucifixion. Just that there's one crucial point where John is different from the synoptic gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is in Jesus' last words on the cross. Right, famous last words most people probably know about are like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is kind of like an outcry of Jesus' anguish and his suffering, maybe an outcry of Jesus' humanity, his frailty in this last moment, feeling like God abandoned him. It's like, did God abandon Jesus? Isn't Jesus supposed to be, one with God? It's like, what's going on there? It's kind of like, well, it's a bit of a riddle or a mystery. But I found out that in John, actually, the last words of Jesus aren't, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So the lament of a sufferer, but actually in John the words are, it is finished. Jesus at the cross right before his death confirms, the completion of his destiny. It's the Greek word tetelestai. It is finished. The mission of the Logos has reached its fulfillment, which is a completely different image, right? It's a completely different conclusion. It's like it's there in John, it's just complete. It's like, like Christ knew exactly what was coming to him. He underwent it all with full composure and always kept in alignment, and then knew that, he did what he had to do and he brought it to its final conclusion. And then he done it, and there's almost like a relief, like sort of having completed the work and having done it perfectly. So that I think is very, very interesting in John.
Very interesting indeed. I also didn't know that. I had no idea about that until like 3 days ago when I was reading that book, that Ajashanti book. And yeah, I always thought his last words were the forgive, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah. We've had the crucifixion, now comes the resurrection. So
we've already been crucified.
We've been crucified. Yeah, crucifixion.
Are we not going to go into the meaning? Okay, it already happened. It's old news now.
I mean, we already went over it a little bit. I mean, do you have anything you want to say about it?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that Jesus is crucified. That's a huge, huge thing. Because it's a radically different... I was thinking about this the other day, actually. This is what I was thinking. Yeah. It's radically different that the fact that Jesus, as this spiritual being and this master, spiritual master, and this sage is actually crucified, and the symbol of Christianity is Jesus on the cross. I mean, that's just a remarkable thing, as opposed to the symbol of all other spiritual teachers and masters and religious leaders, like the Buddha sitting in the meditation pose, or Krishna with his revealing his divine forms, or playing his flute or something. So it's Jesus in this position of suffering and the self-sacrifice, and it's like the passion of Christ and stuff like that. And I think it's just so profound that Jesus represents the Logos and the divine principle and this non-dual consciousness, and that he is being crucified, and he's between these two criminals in the crucifixion, right? These two other criminals who are actually criminals, and even they know that Jesus shouldn't be there. And so Jesus is like sandwiched between these two criminals, and he's being killed in the worst way possible, like this brutal nail to the cross and blood draining out, and it's just horrific. And so it's kind of like this, if Jesus represents this non-dual consciousness, this divine non-dual consciousness, and he's being crucified and suffering, it's almost like what we spoke about in the first episode, where we discussed that the Son of God can be seen as God sending down his Son, and so God, as this non-dual absolute creative consciousness, manifests into the world of form and duality, and then he sends his Son, which is himself incarnating into the world as humans, as you and I. And then his Son, Jesus, is finding himself wedged in this duality and this suffering. And so the incarnation of divine being into the world involves this suffering and this being crucified in the duality, in the separation, and the pain of life, and the the limitations of being a finite being and suffering and old age and death.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, it's just such a radical thing when you think about Jesus as the divine principle and God consciousness and non-dual consciousness in this position of absolute pain and being nailed to a cross. It's just a profound thought and kind of paradox.
Absolutely.
Amazing story.
Yeah, totally. But of course, it's not the end also. Like, Jesus dies on the cross, but it's not the final act, right? And so then we go to, the final chapter of the gospel. So Jesus is, taken from the cross, and he's buried in a tomb. He's laying in a tomb. Mary goes to the tomb where Jesus was buried, and then she sees that the stone has been moved. What Mary does then is she runs to Peter and the beloved disciple. They run to the tomb. The beloved disciple arrives there first, overtakes Peter, arrives there first. But Peter is the one who goes in, and he sees that the strips of linen are there, and the cloth that was wrapped around Jesus' head is there, but Jesus is not there. And then we read in John 20:10-18, that the disciples then return to their homes, but Mary stays outside the tomb. And then it reads, as she wept, she bent down to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and the other at the feet. Woman, why are you weeping? They asked. Oh, because they have taken my Lord away, she said, and I do not know where they have put him. But when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize that it was Jesus. Woman, why are you weeping? Jesus asked. Whom are you seeking? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. So she recognizes Jesus in this moment, right? Then Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go and tell my brothers, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. So this is a huge moment, right? Jesus appears again after he has died, seemingly in the form of the gardener, but his voice reveals his true identity. And before this moment in the gospel, Jesus would always speak of my Father, my Father in heaven, and sort of, being the Son, and et cetera, et cetera. But now he says to Mary, my Father and your Father, my God and your God. So in that very phrase is the affirmation that, the status as the Son of God is not unique to Christ. In saying that, he affirms that Mary is the daughter of the Lord, the daughter of the Father. And so the intimacy that Jesus had until that moment with the Father becomes shared, So there's this, there's this inclusion all of a sudden. So I think that's very significant. Then, of course, there's this whole question of, like, what does it mean that Jesus appeared after he died? This is a huge mystery.
Well, yeah, I think it reveals, thinking along the lines of how Adyashanti described the Gospel of John, and where you see Jesus as totally beyond time and beyond the limitations of the world. He's this perfect being. I think you see an expression of that here with the resurrection. It's like he is so beyond the world, basically. He's so ascended. He's so enlightened. He's so awake. He's so beyond the world and the limitations of the finite body and mind that he's capable of dying and coming back to life, or dematerializing and rematerializing himself. And I think if it's in a mythological sense, you can see it like that, or in an archetypal sense. But did he literally reincarnate and come back to life? It's like, okay, well, I'm not gonna die on that hill and argue that. No, it's a true statement that Jesus literally died and reincarnated, or rematerialized, because it's propositional logic. I wasn't there. I don't know ultimately. But if you see it in the broader sense of history, and in the context that these kind of impossible things do happen in a rare way every now and then it's not inconceivable. And it's part of the story and the mythology and the transmission of Christ.
Yeah, right. Interesting. Well, kind of leave that open-ended then, and let's explore a little bit more of these final verses. Then the gospel ends with this moment where basically Jesus asks Peter to follow him. and then the so-called beloved disciple is staying behind, and then Peter asks Jesus, like, what about him? It's like, I have to follow you, but like, shouldn't he also have to follow you? And then Jesus basically says, like, don't worry about it. You just look after your own mission, your own calling. Don't be concerned with the fate or the destiny of the beloved disciple. Jesus says, like, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. That's what he said. And if you read the commentaries, it's basically saying that, like, yeah, it kind of indicates that there's a different path for the disciples, right? And it's telling Peter to basically not concern himself with the path of the beloved disciple. Peter has his own path.
Interesting.
And yeah, Peter is like, Peter kind of has like role anxiety, or it's like already comparing destinies, like.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like that's not the point.
Yeah. Interesting. All these characters, right? That's what we were saying the other day, that it almost feels like you're watching an episode of Friends or something. All these characters in the story, this drama, this like interpersonal relationships, very human and relatable, and it's weird. It's different to other religious myths and stories. It's very human what's going on a lot of the time. But it's such a powerful, resonant story as well, that it's like this intense Christ consciousness light, like beaming through these human relationships in the story. It's so fascinating.
Totally, yeah. So that's it then. That's a wrap basically on the gospel. We worked through, we didn't cover all of it, but we covered what for me were the most salient parts, and were also the parts that definitely suggest this, the validity of this non-dual reading, basically Jesus as a non-dual teacher, or actually an embodiment of that non-dual state of consciousness. It's like as the Logos, he embodies that, and that's also what he carries out in this message. And I think that that's a very interesting lens. Of course, there are many different lenses you can apply to this gospel and to the other one, and at the end of the day, it's up to people to have their own relationship with these texts. Find their own meaning in it. This is not like this is not a new dogma or something that we're proposing. This is just a suggestion of how you could look at this, right? What the text can give back to you. And it's a reading. It's not the reading, right? That's not necessarily what we're asserting here.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would just wrap up sort of what's the image that we've been portraying here, of Christ, and like what is kind of like the takeaway from this reading of the Gospel of John? Well, I would say it's about a mode of being, that Christ, gives as an example, and that he also portrays in his teaching. We've called it like, alignment with the Logos, alignment with this self-giving truth that is revealed in the figure of Christ. You could also say it's like a movement from fragmentation into communion, right? From the egoic self-enclosure into the relational indwelling, or the transparency of the divine. Alignment produces life, while resistance leads to withering. And so the climax of the gospel is not a spectacle, but it's intimacy. It's abide in me. As I have loved you, love one another. You are in me, and I am in you. And the resurrection, it opens up a new mode of participating in the divine life. It's no longer just Jesus with this special relationship with the Father. It's like, no, my Father and your Father, right? So the Gospel of John, I think, is an invitation. It's an invitation to participate, and I guess I'll leave it there. I think that's a pretty good place to end it.
Yeah, I think I would add, I would say one final remark, which is that the kingdom of heaven is within you. That's the classic. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Florian. Thank you for that guiding us through that deep dive into the Gospel of John. That was a fascinating exploration of the meaning of Christ and the mystery of God and everything like that. So thank you so much. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And if you listened this far, you will get some good karma, I guarantee it. So remember to like, comment, and subscribe for good karma as well. And thank you for watching.